If you're thinking about your past, what it means is you haven't analyzed the causal chains. Because you might say, well, why do you remember your past? Well, you might say, well, it's in order to have an objective, record of the past. It's like it has nothing to do with that. There's only one reason you remember the past, and that's to be prepared for the future. That's why you remember the past. And so what you're supposed to do is take the past and extract out from it wisdom. And wisdom is the ability to avoid stumbling blindly into ditches. Here's a time in my past I stumbled blindly into this horrible ditch and terrible things happened to me. You need to take that apart. You need to figure out, how was it that events conspired with your participation, voluntarily or involuntarily, so that that terrible consequence emerged. You need to know why that happened and how you could react differently in that situation. And as soon as you do that, your brain will leave it alone. It won't obsess you about it anymore, because the anxiety-producing parts of your brain are basically trying to tell you where there are obstacles in your environment. Don't go there, there's fire. Maybe you could master the fire, right? Then you're a wielder of fire, you're not just a victim. And lots of situations are dangerous or not dangerous depending on your level of mastery, right? Life is like that. And so a negative emotion that's associated with a memory is something that's crying out for mastery, and writing can really help with that. You're reorganizing your brain when you write autobiographically. Imagine memories can be stored at different levels of your brain, from sort of primordial, reptilian, image-laden areas that are very emotional, up to finely articulated plans for your future life. Well, you want to take everything that's negative and emotional and transform that into a fully articulated vision for your future. And that frees you of your past. You shouldn't be thinking about your past. I mean, maybe if you're 80 and you're going over a well-spent life, that's a whole different thing. But if you're 30, 35, or 20, and most of the time you're thinking about your past, it's like your soul is trapped back there. You need to free it through investigation. And the metaphysical language is appropriate, because that is, in a sense, what you're doing. You're trapped in the past. It's like you got to break free of that so you can use all your resources to move ahead into the future. Here's another rule. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. This is also a great thing to know, I think. That's a tricky rule. Expedient might be, we're going to have a conversation, and I want something from you. And a lot of conversations are like that, because you have a goal in mind. This is what I want from this person. And so then you craft your conversation to get what you want, right? You subordinate your words to the ethic of your desire. And you might say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, what do you know about what you want? Like, haven't you been wrong about that before? Or you might say, well, what's the alternative? Well, is there an alternative? Well, you have to want something from the person to even interact with them. It's like, no, you could want to see what happens. You could want to play. You could tell the truth. That's an interesting thing to do, because you don't know what's going to happen if you tell the truth, that's for sure. You could let go of what you want and just say what you think. And you could presume, and this is an act of faith too, that the truth does set you free, and that the truth that's spoken properly makes out of possibility the order that is habitable and good. And then you could just tell the truth, and you could see what happens, and that would be an adventure. And that's better than expediency, partly because maybe you're wrong about what you want. And you know that because you're kind of narrow and maybe narrowly self-serving from time to time, and your purview of the world isn't as wide as it could be, and you're a bit bitter, so you tend to be that narrowly selfish because of that. And so you want something from a conversation, and you bend and twist it to get it. It's like, fine, but maybe you'll get something you don't want. Or worse, you'll get something that's positively bad for you. That happens a lot. And so part of the reason there's a deep moral injunction to tell the truth in a religious sense is because there's a hypothesis behind that, which is there isn't anything better that can happen to you than what will happen to you if you tell the truth. Now, that might be hidden from you because sometimes if you tell the truth, and I don't mean to blurt everything out carelessly, like this is a sophisticated thing to do. It's not careless. It doesn't mean just say any old thing that pops into your head. You have to be judicious with the truth. But the notion would be, if something emerges as a consequence of engaging truthfully, and it doesn't seem to be going your way, wait. There's more to the story to unfold, because like, how do you know if it goes your way or not? Like, over what time span are you calculating this? Because sometimes things can go pretty badly initially and then much better as they progress. And lots of times the truth has that effect, because you reveal something that's maybe disturbing or shocking even to yourself and to others, and it causes waves, especially if it's a deep truth, and that destabilizes everything. It's like, yeah, but maybe that's preferable to a false peace. You can't find out if it's true without doing it. You're not going to gather the evidence beforehand. So that's the truth side of it. Meaning, pursue what's meaningful instead of what's expedient. It's another hint, like the spirit of play, about the pathway. The yin and yang symbol, the famous symbol, it's two serpents, one black, one white, head to tail. Inside the black serpent, there's a white dot, and inside the white serpent, there's a black dot. And the representation is something like, the world of your experience is made up of chaos and order. And order is where you are when things are going according to what you want. And chaos is everything that can come in and disrupt that. And both of those can be positive and negative. Too much order, tyranny, right? Too much chaos, nihilistic uncertainty. Optimized balance. So let's think about what the optimized balance would mean. You have a structure of perception and conception that you inhabit. It's orderly, reasonably orderly. Orderly enough so that when you inhabit it, most of the time things are going the way you want them to go. But things change and shift, and you don't know everything you should know. So you can't just stay where you are with a good thing. You have to expand. And as you expand, you move out of the domain of order into the domain of chaos, or out of the domain of actuality into the domain of possibility. And then you might think, well, how do you know when you're doing that optimally? Well, one marker, as I said before, maybe that you do it in the spirit of play. But another is, and this is so much worth knowing, things get meaningful. People ask, does life have any meaning? It's like, why is anything worth doing if in 4 billion years the sun is going to envelop the earth? And the answer to that question is, that's a stupid question. And I can prove that in some sense. It's like, you're a mother and your baby's crying, and so you're going over there to do something about it. And someone comes along and says, why do you care if that baby's crying? In 4 billion years, the sun is going to envelop the earth. And what's the right response to that? It's something like, go away. Are you out of your mind? And the answer to that question is yes, you are out of your mind. Of course, you can find a time frame or a spatial frame of reference that makes everything you do pointless. It's like, what is this going to matter in 20 trillion years? Well, it's like, the only proper response to that is, that's not a wise time frame. Imagine you're in a concert, listening to some great music, and it's got you, and someone taps you on the shoulder, and this is going to come to an end. And well, what's your response? Like, go away. And that's the right response to that voice in your head that does those things to you, which says, you're engaged in something, and a nihilistic thought comes out. Well, what's the point of this, given, how unbearable the world is in the current political situation, and the fact that we're inhabiting some ball of dust on the edge of some fringe part of the cosmos, and that everything's dead and material. It's like, get thee behind me, Satan, right? Really. It's not a mark of wisdom. It's not a mark of wisdom to let nihilistic, demonic voices steal your joie de vivre. That is not a mark of wisdom. And you might object, well, at least it's not naive. It's like, yeah, cynicism might be preferable to naivety, but it doesn't hold a candle to wisdom. And that's worth knowing too. Because once you've been hurt and you're cynical, there's no going back to naive. But there's no point in staying at cynical. And there are degrees of courage way beyond cynicism. And some of that is the regaining of the faith you had as a child despite your current level of wisdom. And that's something to strive for, right? That's a moral attainment. That's not a burying your head back in the sand. Quite the contrary. And so, well, back to the yin and yang symbol. Imagine you have an instinct that orients you. Well, you do, as a matter of fact. There's a reflex that's replicated at multiple levels of your nervous system, and it's ancient. If you have a nervous system as an animal, you have this reflex. And the reflex is something like surprise. You know, if I walk across the stage and I hear a loud noise behind me, I might go like this. And that would be automatic because I'm gripped by unconscious systems. And what's happening is some chaos has emerged and it stops me in my tracks because something unexpected happened, my current plan is incomplete. And then I'll turn and orient towards the place of the disturbance. And that's the beginning of exploratory behavior. And then I might run away, which might make me safe, or I might cautiously investigate, in which case I can find out what caused the disturbance, maybe rectify it, and maybe update my plan so that that sort of thing doesn't happen again. That's a better approach. You know, if you take people, and I told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created, to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world. So what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. And then the second part of that is, well, imagine that many people did that, because we've done a lot as human beings. We've done a lot of remarkable things. And I've told you already, I think before, that today, for example, about 250,000 people will be lifted out of abject poverty, and about 300,000 people attached to the electrical power grid. We're lifting people out of poverty collectively at a faster rate that's ever occurred in the history of humankind by a huge margin. And that's been going on unbelievably quickly since the year 2000. The UN had planned to have poverty between 2000 and 2015, and it was accomplished by 2013. So there's inequality developing in many places, and you hear lots of political agitation about that. But overall, the tide is lifting everyone up, and that's a great thing. We have no idea how fast we can multiply that if people got their act together and really aimed at it. Because, you know, my experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth
$20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate. It's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be, who knows how much more efficient? 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's completely, it's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time. Not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal, or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really, really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt. And that's the thing that's interesting too, is that, and like another thing I've often asked my undergraduate classes is, you know, there's this idea that people have a conscience. And you know what the conscience is. It's this feeling or voice you have in your head just before you do something that you know is stupid, telling you that probably you shouldn't do that stupid thing. You don't have to listen to it, strangely enough, but you go ahead and do it anyways, and then of course exactly what the conscience told you was going to happen inevitably happens, so that you feel even stupider about it than you would if it happened by accident, because you know, I knew this was going to happen, I got a warning it was going to happen, and I went and did it anyways. And the funny thing too is that conscience operates within people, and we really don't understand what the hell that is. So you might say, well, what would happen if you abided by your conscience for 5 years or for 10 years? What sort of position might you be in? What sort of family might you have? What sort of relationship might you be able to forge? And you can be bloody sure that a relationship that's forged on the basis of who you actually are is going to be a lot stronger and more welcome than one that's forged on the basis of who you aren't. Now, of course, that means that the person you're with has to deal with the full force of you in all your ability and your catastrophe, and that's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate. But if you do negotiate it, well, at least you have something, you have somewhere solid to stand, and you have somewhere to live, you have a real life, and it's a great basis upon which to bring children into the world, for example, because you can have an actual relationship with them instead of torturing them half to death, which is what happens in a tremendously large minority of cases. Well, it's more than that too, because, and this is what I'll close with, and this is why I wanted to introduce Solzhenitsyn's writings to you. You see, because it isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate, it's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you know, you think, well, there's 9 billion, 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly. But 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion. And so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least, over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1 million, and 2 persons away from 1 billion. And so that's how you're connected. And the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend. And it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really asked yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. but I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. You know, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life, and they still suffer. Yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr, so that's a pretty good deal, all things considered, especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, what Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends, because that's what happened in the 20th century.
What sort of life would you have to have so that you could bear your suffering nobly? That's a good question to ask yourself. Now, and so we had people just write for 15 minutes. If you could have what you wanted, needed, what might that look like? And there's an instruction there too, is do it badly. Because what the hell do you know? And besides, your vision's going to change as you progress through your life. And so you're not going to get it done perfectly, but that's okay. Get it down. Get a rough first draft down, right? A rough approximation of who you could be if you got your act together. And not who other people think you should be, you know? Although that might enter into it because you don't want to be completely... You can't be who you are properly and ignore the fact that you're embedded in a social context. And so you have to take the fact that there are other people into account. And it doesn't mean be who your parents think you should be either, even though that's another source of information that you might want to consider. It's a deeper question. It's like, what would actually motivate you? And you might think, well, I could never have that. It's like, that's not the question that's being addressed here. Although I would say, there's no sense floating off into some kind of impossible juvenile fantasy. We're making an assumption that you're taking the question seriously and that you're going to remain within the bounds of what you regard as sanely reasonable. So that's the first part. Second part was the opposite of that. It's like, okay, now you've specified a goal, where the goal is, in some sense, both your character and your life. And you've specified that rather vaguely. You only had 15 minutes to write about it. And that's a good thing, because now you have something to move toward. Now, I could tell you this technically. This is an interesting thing to know. People say they want to be happy. That's not true, by the way. If you investigate what people mean when they say they want to be happy, they say, I just want to be happy. It's a very funny phrase. It's, what do you mean, just? Like, there isn't anything harder than that. So you can't just say just, that's all you want. You just want to be happy all the time. That's all it would take. It's like, good luck with that. That's not going to happen. So you can get rid of the just. And then, I want to be happy. Well, maybe. Actually, what people really mean when they say that is they don't want to suffer and be miserable. So really what they mean is they don't want to experience excess negative emotion. And you can find that out if you carefully question people and carefully analyze the answers. You find out they're actually more concerned about avoiding the catastrophic negative than living in a world of hedonistic delight. Now, you also find that while avoiding the catastrophic tragedy, they wouldn't mind having a little bit of hedonistic delight. And so some happiness is interleaved in there. Then you might ask yourself, to the degree that people do want hedonistic delight when they're being happy, what does happy mean? And you might think, well, happy means getting what you want. Happy is how you feel after Christmas dinner. It's like, no, that's asleep, right? That's content and asleep. Now that's a form of contentment, but it isn't really what people mean when they say that they want to be happy. The happiness that people refer to when they talk about happiness has more to do with enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is an interesting word because it means, it's entheos. It means to be inspired. Inspired is in spirit. It means to be imbued with the Spirit. Well, enthusiastic is to be imbued with the Spirit of God, interestingly enough. And we'll return to that. When do you experience the positive emotion that's associated with happiness? The answer is, not when you've attained a goal, but when you're pursuing one. So you're set up, your positive emotion is associated with movement forward. You could say that your positive emotion is the psychological equivalent of forward movement, just as your negative emotion is the psychological equivalent of freezing or retreating. And so your emotions are very tightly tied to your action. Freeze, retreat, negative. Advance towards a goal, positive. No goal, no positive emotion. Now, if you don't remember anything else from tonight, that's a good thing to remember. No goal, no positive emotion. A corollary of that as well is no goal, confusion. So no goal not only means no positive emotion, it also means confusion, and confusion means anxiety and dread. And so a life without a goal is confusing and hopeless. And that begs the question, what should the goal be? And that's partly what we're trying to establish. You wrote for 15 minutes, you try to develop a vision for your life. Now you have something to move toward. That sets up the precondition for potential positive emotion and happiness. What else do you need to motivate you? Well, how about negative emotion? So what do you do with that? Well, negative emotion can stop you. You might think, well, I'd like to get a better job, but I'm afraid of putting myself out in the job market. I'm afraid of being evaluated. I'm afraid that if I tried something more difficult, I might fail. Then you have your negative emotion opposing you, right? It's anxiety is stopping you. And fair enough, because there are things to be anxious about. But what if you could get your negative emotion behind you, pushing you instead of stopping you? Sometimes in my clinical practice, I would have clients who hated their job. They're laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And maybe that was partly because they'd turned themselves into slaves, but it didn't matter. They were laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. They needed to make a move, laterally or up. They needed to make a move. And they were often afraid to, and they had their reasons. They didn't want to contemplate their resumes. They didn't want to open up their CVs. They didn't want to face the inadequacies of their past. They were afraid of being evaluated. They were afraid of being rejected. They didn't know how to negotiate. They didn't know how to conduct themselves in an interview. They were afraid of losing the security they'd already built up. They had their fears, and they were real, and those fears stopped them. But they'd come to me and say, oh my God, you know, I'm so miserable. My life is so miserable. And we'd take that apart. And one of the reasons was because they were laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And then we'd talk that through, and they'd say, well, I'm afraid to make a change. And I'd say, well, that's okay. That's understandable. How afraid are you of not making a change? Let's make a little vision of that. You're 35, you hate your job. What's the consequence? You're not motivated. You don't want to get out of bed in the morning. You're starting to get depressed. You're getting bitter. You're getting resentful. You're getting cynical. You're amotivated at work. You're not doing a very good job. And you're starting to shrink. Now play that out for 10 years. You don't change it. You don't fix it. And what happens? Well, it's not like it's going to get better of its own accord. What's going to happen to you? Well, for sure, at minimum, what's going to happen to you is you're going to be in the same situation but 10 years older. And if you can't get out of that situation now, what the hell makes you think you're going to get out of it in 10 years? You're 10 years older, you're 10 years more bitter, you're 10 years more cynical. Maybe by that time your marriage has collapsed because who the hell wants to live with you? You're even more of a slave than you were because you've labored another 10 years under the thumb of the tyrant and stepped backwards every time you were asked to, so you got smaller and smaller as the tyrant got bigger and bigger. It's like, think about that, and that means imagine it. Imagine that, okay? Now that's the situation. You're stuck where you are, but it's 10 years from now. And when I say think of that, I mean imagine that. It's like really play it out. It's like, you know how miserable you are now? You're afraid of making the necessary changes, but you know how miserable you are now. Just imagine how miserable you could be in 10 years. And in all likelihood, what you'll find is that you're way more afraid of that than you are of whatever's stopping you in the present. It's really useful to know what your own particular brand of hell might be. And so one of the things we do in this writing exercise is have people do the reverse. It's like, okay, so imagine now, 5 years from now, you've let whatever temptations you're particularly susceptible to have the upper hand. And they've augured you into the ground. You know, one person's an alcoholic, another person's a criminal, another person's living on the street, someone else is like skirting the edges of prostitution, somebody else is narcissistic and bitter, somebody else is depressed and anxious. You know where you would fall off the edge of the earth if you fell off in whatever direction you're prone to fall off. Everyone knows that, but we avoid that. You know, that's rule 3. Do not hide things in the fog. Is that the rule? Do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Yeah, well, we often won't allow ourselves to imagine the catastrophe that we're pursuing, let's say through inaction. That's a good thing to fix. So now you say, well, you think for 15 minutes, that's not very long, but who you could be and what you could have if you could have what you wanted if you were who you could be. And then you think about what sort of hell you could produce for yourself if you didn't do that. And that's not a bad polarity. It's like, I'm going to get away from that and I'm going to move towards that. And then you have your negative emotion working for you and your positive emotion working for you. And that's a good gradient, and that's a great gradient emotionally, because as I said, you don't experience positive emotion except in relationship to a goal. And if you've got a nice gradient on your goal pursuit, then that's going to increase the degree to which you feel positive emotion. And positive emotion, by the way, isn't just about being happy. That's the most trivial part of it in some sense. Positive emotion allows you to focus. It's the soul of concentration. It's the essence of enthusiastic motivation. When you say, I really want to do that, that statement is predicated on the existence of positive emotion. It's the fact that the goal beckons to you that makes you say, I want to do that. And you know how much easier it is to do something you want to do than to do something you don't want to do. And that ease is actually a consequence of the activation of the system that governs positive emotion. And you might ask yourself, well, how powerful a system is that? And I would say, well, almost all of the drugs of abuse that people are most prone to abusing are abused because they activate the positive emotion system. So cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin is also a painkiller, but it has a psychomotor stimulant element. That's the technical term for the pharmacological effect of pharmacological agents on the positive emotion system. Psychomotor stimulation, psychomotor because it's associated with movement forward. And cocaine is such a powerful drug because it makes you feel like you're doing something worthwhile. That's the system it hyperactivates. And so it's a primary system of motivation. It's as old as forward movement itself. It's a cardinal source of meaning. And it only manifests itself in relationship to a goal. You have to be tough as a damn boot to be good, Because you have to stand your ground when you need to stand your ground. And you have to be able to say no when it's time to say no. And you have to mean it. And so then you have to think and plan strategically so that when you're going to say no, you can mean it and it will stick. You know, and that takes a certain amount of integrated malevolence, I would say. And once it's integrated, it's not malevolence, it's strength. It's strength of character. It's the ability to stand your ground. And you have to cultivate that. And you cultivate that at least in part by telling the truth. And so you take your place in the world as a decent person and as a decent citizen, and you play the hierarchical game properly. And that is to stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's like the world's an onslaught. You've got the tyranny of culture to deal with. You've got the catastrophe of nature. You've got your own damn malevolence and ignorance, right? All coming at you, plus the incredible, complicated, indeterminate potential of the future. That's all coming at you, and it's all your responsibility. And you can cringe away from it and be afraid of it and be victimized by it and be bitter and cynical about it. And no wonder, because it can be painful. Or you can turn around and you can say, man, bring it on, because there's more to me than there is to the catastrophe. And this is what I discovered from looking at what I looked at. I looked at the darkest things I could look at, really, for 30 years. I was really a lot of fun to be around, I can tell you. I looked at the darkest things that I could think of, right? Not only what happened in Auschwitz and what happened in the Gulag, but personal issues. You know, it's like I wasn't so much interested in the totalitarians as a group. I was interested in the people who undertook the terrible acts that the totalitarians required. You know, the people who, I was just rereading Ordinary Men, and it was a story about a police battalion in Poland that trained ordinary policemen to take naked pregnant women out into the fields and shoot them in the back of the head. It takes a lot of training, by the way, before you can bring yourself to do that. And you aren't the same person by the end of it. It's pretty goddamn horrific. You know, and I was trying to figure out, what would it be like to be that person? Because we are that person. And then what would it be like to not be that person, right? To refuse to do that, to not participate in that. You know, and what I discovered by making that totalitarian proclivity personal was that there's more to us than there is to the horror. As nature is, bent on our destruction, bad as culture is, tyrannical and bloody, back as far as you can look, as malevolent as you are in the darkest part of your heart, and that's plenty malevolent. The possibility that's within you that can well up, the courage and the truth and the ability and the skill and the willingness to set things right, if you are willing to set them right, is more powerful than all of that. And so it's so interesting. It was proof for me of an old saying I read from Carl Jung. It's an alchemical motif, in sterquilinus inventur, which is what you most want to be found will be found where you least want to look, essentially. And it's so interesting because it means that if you're willing to turn around and to stand up straight, and face the darkness, like fully, what you discover at the darkest part is the brightest light. And that's something that's so much worth discovering, because there's going to be terrible darkness in your life. And it's going to make you cynical and bitter. And it could easily be that you're just not looking at it enough. Because if you looked at it enough, and you didn't shy away, and you brought everything you had to bear on it, you'd find that there was more to you than there was to the horror. You know, I watched my father-in-law. I'll end with this. And you know, you don't know, because you're not bringing your A game to the table with all that cynicism and bitterness and resentment and willful blindness and avoidance. Maybe you're playing at 60%. It's not good enough, because there's too much of what's bad for 60% to be good enough. It's like you need 90% or 95% or 100%. When about 15, 20 years ago, my mother-in-law developed frontal temporal dementia, which I wouldn't recommend. You know, it's one of those degenerative neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, and those bloody things are like they're in the top echelon of awful. You know, you watch a person deteriorate before your eyes. It's a lengthy, lengthy death. And And it was slow. And her husband, he lived in this little town that I grew up in, about 3,000 people. And he was quite a character, man. Everybody knew him. I bought him a Foghorn Leghorn t-shirt once, because that's kind of what he was like. He was loud and sort of bombastic, but he stood up straight, I can tell you. And he played the fool a little bit, mostly for the amusement of people, but he was no damn fool. And I always admired him and liked him. And the feeling was mutual, thank God, since I married his daughter. And, you know, he drank a lot with his crazy friends up in northern Alberta, and he wasn't at home a lot because he was working a lot. And you know, he was kind of a party animal about town, but a good businessman and a good man. And then his wife got sick, and they moved to another town. And, you know, he took care of her for like 15 years. It was unbelievable as she deteriorated, you know, and she got more desperate to have him around, and her love for him never went away. Even as she lost herself almost completely, she would always light up when he came into the room, you know. And he took care of her right till within weeks of her death. He had to finally put her in an old folks' home because he was no longer strong enough to lift her up from the chair. And we interacted with him a lot, you know, because we were trying to help him figure out how to cope. And we had signs put up in the house, electronic signs that would tell her when he was leaving, so that she would know where he went. And we had recordings in the bathroom so that she knew what to do when she went into the bathroom. And we tried to do everything we could to not make this absolutely bloody, atrocious experience complete hell. And he participated the whole way, you know, and it was really something to see. It was really it left me with a tremendous sense of admiration for him, but not just for him, but for people who can do that, you know. And if there was a new decline, he took it on, and he didn't complain about it, and he tried to do what he could, you know. And like, it was no picnic, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't hell. And then we were all gathered around the deathbed, my wife's mother's deathbed, and the family was there, and they got along pretty well, you know. Her sister's a palliative care nurse, and the other one's a pharmacist, and none of them are particularly afraid of illness and death. You know, they're a pretty tough group. And so, you know, they made sure their mother's lips were wet while she was no longer eating or drinking, and tried to make her comfortable. And they're around the deathbed, and they were kind of getting along, you know. It wasn't family feud at mother's death time, and that was kind of nice. And she died, and that was that. But it wasn't just that, because the fact that the family had coped with it well and nobly and honorably, I would say, brought them together. They were closer afterwards than they were before. And they all had more respect for their father. And then in the old folks' home, he met another woman who had a husband there who had Alzheimer's. And they got to know each other, you know. And he died after a while, and she died after a while. And then a few months later, they started going out. And then eventually they had a relationship, and now they live together. And so he gained something. Like, it wasn't that he replaced what he lost, you know what I mean? Because he still has pictures of his wife up in his house, and she was the love of his life, and that's not going away. But, you know, his family respected him more, and everybody pulled together more. And it wasn't hell at the deathbed, it was just tragedy. And the family pulled together more. And that was a good example of how you can extract at least a certain amount of light out of what's dark, even at a personal level. And it's worth asking yourself. It's like, drop what you're doing that's foolish, that you know is foolish, and pick an aim that's worthwhile, you know, to make things better for yourself, like you're worth taking care of, like you're worth something, you know, and to surround yourself with people who believe the same, and who are rejoicing in your accomplishments and unhappy when you fail, right? And you're comparing yourself to your accomplishments of yesterday and not to someone else's today, so that you're not jealous and bitter. And you put your own house in order so that you're not cursing the world when some of its disarray might be your fault. And you're trying to pursue something meaningful, and you're doing your best to tell the truth, and all of that. And then you see what happens. Who the hell are you? You know, you think you're a miracle of some bloody bizarre sort. We've been around for 3.5 billion years. You know, every single one of your relatives propagated successfully. And here you are, against all possible odds, in this world of hell in some sense, and bitterness and tyranny and malevolence. And yet, God only knows what's inside you, this capacity for consciousness, the capacity to confront potential and to turn it into something good. That's us, man. That's the Western story. That's the individual as the cornerstone of the state. That's our responsibility, and it really is who we are.
You know, if you take people, and I told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created, to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world, so what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. And then the second part of that is, well, imagine that many people did that, because we've done a lot as human beings. We've done a lot of remarkable things, and I've told you already, I think before, that today, for example, about 250,000 people will be lifted out of abject poverty, and about 300,000 people attached to the electrical power grid. We're lifting people out of poverty collectively at a faster rate that's ever occurred in the history of humankind by a huge margin. And that's been going on unbelievably quickly since the year 2000. The UN had planned to have poverty between 2000 and 2015, and it was accomplished by 2013. So there's inequality developing in many places, and you hear lots of political agitation about that. But overall, the tide is lifting everyone up, and that's a great thing. We have no idea how fast we can multiply that if people got their act together and really aimed at it. Because, you know, my experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week. It's 100 hours a month. That's 2.5 full work weeks. It's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year, and you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be, who knows how much more efficient? 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time. Not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal, or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really, really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt. And that's the thing that's interesting too, is that, and like another thing I've often asked my undergraduate classes is, you know, there's this idea that people have a conscience. And you know what the conscience is. It's this feeling or voice you have in your head just before you do something that you know is stupid, telling you that probably you shouldn't do that stupid thing. You don't have to listen to it, strangely enough, but you go ahead and do it anyways, and then of course exactly what the conscience told you was going to happen inevitably happens, so that you feel even stupider about it than you would if it happened by accident, because you know, I knew this was going to happen, I got a warning it was going to happen, and I went and did it anyways. And the funny thing too is that conscience operates within people, and we really don't understand what the hell that is. So you might say, well, what would happen if you abided by your conscience for 5 years or for 10 years? What sort of position might you be in? What sort of family might you have? What sort of relationship might you be able to forge? And you can be bloody sure that a relationship that's forged on the basis of who you actually are is going to be a lot stronger and more welcome than one that's forged on the basis of who you aren't. Now, of course, that means that the person you're with has to deal with the full force of you in all your ability and your catastrophe, and that's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate. But if you do negotiate it, well, at least you have something, you have somewhere solid to stand, and you have somewhere to live, you have a real life, and it's a great basis upon which to bring children into the world, for example, because you can have an actual relationship with them instead of torturing them half to death, which is what happens in a tremendously large minority of cases. Well, it's more than that too, because, and this is what I'll close with, and this is why I wanted to introduce Solzhenitsyn's writings to you. You see, because it isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate, it's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you know, you think, well, there's 9 billion, 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly. But 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion. And so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least, over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1 million, and 2 persons away from 1 billion. And so that's how you're connected. And the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend. And it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really asked yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. But I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. Now, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life and they still suffer, yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr, so that's a pretty good deal, all things considered, especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, what Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends. because that's what happened in the 20th century.
If you're looking at a complex phenomenon like male aggression, let's say, well, what causes male aggression? Well, the first thing you do is generate like 20 possible reasons. You don't limit yourself to the one you like. You know, like maybe I'm not that happy about TV. And so I think, well, TV violence probably makes men more violent. It doesn't, by the way. There's very little evidence that it does. There's quite a lot of evidence that it doesn't. Video games, because I think they're a waste of time. So they probably increase male aggression. It's like, well, no, they don't, as it turns out. Alcohol, that definitely increases aggression, male aggression and female aggression for that matter. So alcohol is a major contributor. Is it sociological? Is it cultural? Do you learn it? Is it biological? You generate all sorts of potential reasons. And you might also say, well, many of those reasons apply, not just one. And then you test them. And then the next thing you do, maybe you say, well, I want to decrease male aggression. Well, you don't assume that you know how to do that, and that if you do what you think you know, that it will work. That's all ideological thinking. The real world is way too complicated to be pushed around by that kind of thinking. And poverty, well, what causes poverty? Well, what do you mean by poverty? Well, you could think for 2 weeks about what poverty is, and you still wouldn't come to the end of it. Do you mean lower education? Do you mean lower intelligence? Do you mean lower conscientiousness? Do you mean drug and alcohol abuse? Do you mean lack of money? Do you mean absolute poverty? Do you mean relative poverty? Do you calculate that neighborhood by neighborhood or state by state? Do you mean poverty of hope? Do you mean lack of plan for the future? Et cetera, et cetera. And all of those questions, so you decompose, so you think, well, poverty is caused by lack of money. It's like, really, that's your theory, is it? Well, it's not good enough, that theory. It's not even, most things that are truly problematic are so complex that no ideological solution can possibly suffice. It's just not a good way to go about the problem. And then there's the other problem too, which is that, well, one of the terrible temptations of an ideology is that once you parse out the world and have your reasons why problems exist. So let's say poverty exists because of capitalism, which is a completely idiotic theory. I mean, poverty exists because people are born with nothing, and it's hard to acquire goods. So the default state is poverty. So it's not caused by any sociological system. So it's foolish to begin with. But let's assume that you think that poverty, or at least relative poverty, is caused by capitalism. Well, then you have a convenient enemy. It's everyone who's a successful capitalist is now responsible for poverty, and then they're bad and you're good. And that's unearned moral virtue. And that's unbelievably attractive to acquire unearned moral virtue. Maybe you're someone who's inherited your wealth, and then you think everyone who's poor is just lazy. And if they get up off their ass and get a job, that would solve the problem. It's like, well, that's convenient for you. But it's a very shallow analysis of the problem. And so it's not helpful to think that way unless what you want to do is not think. I've written about this, pursue what's meaningful and not what's expedient. And I would also say that it's useful to say what is true rather than to craft your words so that you get what you want. And part of the reason for that, there's many reasons, but part of the reason for that is that it's unbelievably adventurous. You have no idea what will happen if you just say what you think. And my experience has been that the consequences are absolutely overwhelming. Always, constantly. And, when I go into a talk like this, I don't have an outcome in mind. I don't want to make a fool of myself. I don't want to say something stupid. I want to engage in an interesting conversation, but I don't have an agenda other than that. But it's just to say what I feel in the moment as clearly as I possibly can. It's so adventurous to do that. And it's far better than pursuing a more narrow goal that might be wrong. I've never seen anything as rewarding as the consequences of forthright speech, the opportunity to be of genuine service to other people. There's way more reward in that
than in any of the things that people chase in a more finite and limited way. I would say, though, that with regards to the conflict between, let's say, miserable wisdom and happy ignorance, is that there's different forms of rewards to be found in different places. You can think about this even in terms of personality. One major personality dimension is extroversion. And the reason for that is that we have a pleasure circuit, and how active that is varies between people. That's what causes variation in extroversion. And we generally equate happiness with the activation of the circuitry that's associated with extroversion. And drugs like cocaine and amphetamines activate that circuit. But there's another personality dimension, which is openness. And openness is the creativity dimension. And there's pleasure to be derived from that as well. And so that's philosophical exploration and literary experience. And I suppose when you go to a movie, you experience a blend of those two things, especially if it's a rather complex movie. So there's different forms of engagement or pleasure to be found, and some of them are more akin to happiness, and some of them are more akin to meaning. And sometimes they come into conflict, but I think all things considered, they work best when they're working together. And I do strive diligently to, and I think that this has really been brought home to me. Look, I couldn't sit down. I literally couldn't sit down for almost a year. And so I lost the ability to sit down. I had fantasies for hours of being able to sit by a fireplace and just not move, because I had this condition called akathisia, which is, I learned how valuable it is to be able to sit down. And now when I sit down and nothing is happening, I'm taking stock of that and noticing what an unbelievable gift that is. And it is really useful to maintain your ability to see what you have that you've taken for granted, because you can lose everything. You can lose things you don't even know you have. I had no idea that you could ever lose the ability just to sit down, but you can. I wouldn't recommend it. So I'm more appreciative, I would say, of simpler things than I was. I'm more appreciative of other people than I was. I'm probably more grateful, all things considered, than I was. And hopefully that will continue developing. I have no contempt for happiness. I tell people, don't pursue happiness, pursue meaning. And I think that's true. But if happiness comes along, it should be welcomed. And if you're ever somewhere where that's happening, you should notice it and be grateful for it and enjoy it. And
what happens to you as you stroll merrily on your way through life? Well, what happens is that as you're moving from point A to point B, you encounter things. And people think that what they encounter are objects, but that's not the case. First of all, most of the things that you encounter, many of the things are actually other people, and they're not objects. They're too damn complex. And even apart from the social world, the things that you encounter aren't objects. They seem to be something more like tools or obstacles. And I don't mean that we see objects and turn them into tools or obstacles. I mean that we see tools and obstacles, because what happens is that when you array yourself towards a goal, then the world transforms itself into things that get in the way of that goal, and three things. Things that get in the way of the goal, those are things you don't like. Things that facilitate your movement towards the goal, those are things that you like. And irrelevant things. And mostly you want irrelevant things, because there's just too damn many things. So the category of irrelevant is one you really like. So most of everything is irrelevant if you have a good plan. A few things are good because they move you forward, and some other things are not so good. You want to go around the not so good things if you can manage them, unless you like to run head forth into like brick walls, which is not particularly, it's a learning experience, but I wouldn't repeat it too many times. You want the world to array itself as a set of, we could say, tools. Now, what happens is that you have this perceptual system that's mediated by dopamine. It's the same system that cocaine activates, or methamphetamine, or the drugs that people really like to take. And it's the dopaminergic system that responds with positive emotion to indications that you've encountered something that will facilitate your movement towards a goal. And that's really important to know, because people tend to think that they're happy because they achieve goals, and that's not true. what's true, because as soon as you achieve a goal, then you have a problem, which is what's the next goal. And that's actually a big problem. You encounter that as soon as you graduate from university, for example. That's right. I made this joke before. Graduation day, you're like king of the university hierarchy, undergraduate hierarchy. Day after, you're unemployed potential Starbucks employee, right? So it's like, so obviously the accomplishment per se as a source of reward is problematic, because when you accomplish, you run the frame to its end, and then you have the problem of needing a new frame. So that's a problem. But if what you're encountering instead are things that will move you along your way, it's like, hey, that's great, and that's where you get your positive motivation. And so that's really thinking, that's so much worth thinking about. You can think about that for a year, and that wouldn't even be enough to think about it, because here's what it means. It means in some sense that the Buddhists are right with their claim about Maya, M-A-Y-A, which means that people live in an illusion. And what they mean by that is, well, you have goal, whatever your goal is, and that goal gives relevance to the world. And you can change the relevance of the world in a snap just by changing your goal. You can do that. And so then you think, well, it's sort of an illusion because you can just change it. Now, you don't want to push that line of argumentation too far, because even if the specific point can be changed, the fact that you're in one of these frames cannot be changed. And so you have to be in a frame, although you get to pick the frame. So there's still an absolute there, which is that you have to be in a frame, and that is not a trivial absolute. It's a very major absolute. So then you think, okay, all of your positive emotion is going to be experienced in relationship to the goal. Well, then we think, well, you could use some positive emotion. It's a good thing. Positive emotion inhibits anxiety and disappointment and frustration and pain. It does all that. Technically, it does that. That's why a football player with a broken thumb who wants to score a touchdown can go out there and, play the football game, even though it's a kind of an arbitrary goal, right? It's like, really, you're going to go out there and like risk your hand to fire a pigskin through some poles? It's like, well, you can say the same sort of cynical thing about most of the things that people do, but you can't say the cynical thing about the fact that they have to do things. So you have a point, you have your aim, you have your ambition, and then that's what turns the world into a potentially positive place. And here's the kicker. This is so cool. The higher the aim, the more the positive emotion. So that's you think, well, why should I bother? Why should I bother doing something lofty and difficult? It's like, because it's worth it. That's why. Because the alternative is stupid suffering. Because really, because what happens is, like, you don't need a framework in order to suffer. You can just lay there day after day and suffer, right? That's easy. So that's the default condition. If you don't have a lofty ambition, then you suffer miserably. And the reason for that is life is really complex, short, finite, full of suffering, and beyond you. And so you can just lay there and think about that, and it's horrible. And so that's not helpful. It's just not useful. And so, people often say life is meaningless. It's like, no, it's not. That's wrong. Because if it was meaningless, that'd be easy. You could just sit there and do nothing, and it wouldn't matter, right? It'd be like you were like a lobotomized sheep. It's just irrelevant. But that isn't what happens. When people say that life has no meaning, that isn't what they mean. What they mean is, I'm suffering stupidly and intensely, and I don't know what to do about it. Well, the suffering is meaningful. It's just not the kind of meaning you want. So how do you get out of that? You note the baseline of suffering, which is very, 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 very high. And then you say to yourself, okay, I need to do something that justifies that. And that's not so easy, because the baseline for suffering is high. If you're going to make something of yourself, let's say, so that it's worthwhile to exist in the world, then you have to aim at something that's so well structured that you can say, yeah, earthquakes, cancer, death of my family, dissolution of my goals, ultimate futility of life, and the heat death of the universe. Hey, it doesn't matter, it's worth it. It's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world.
Competent and dangerous?
Mm-hmm.
Why dangerous?
Because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak. They're weak.
How is it good to be dangerous?
Because it makes you formidable. And life is a very difficult process. And you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order. And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. It's like, that's a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea. Because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life. You can't bear any responsibility. You'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous.
But one thing I'm not getting, there's a big difference between letting people do something for themselves and saying men should be dangerous. By dangerous, that implies I should be ready to threaten someone, to hurt somebody.
No, you should be capable of it. But that doesn't mean you should use it. There's nothing to you otherwise. Like if you're not a formidable force, there's no morality in your self-control. If you're incapable of violence, not being violent isn't a virtue. People who teach martial arts know this full well, right? If you learn a martial art, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously you learn to control it. Both of those come together. And the combination of that capacity for danger and the capacity for control is what brings about the virtue. Otherwise you confuse weakness with moral virtue. I'm harmless, therefore I'm good. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. That isn't how it works at all. If you're harmless, you're just weak. And if you're weak, you're not going to be good. You can't be, because it takes strength to be good. It's very difficult to be good.
People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure, because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. You can't, if you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. But do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle, and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile.
You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work. attention to your mental and physical health, etc. You know, that's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful, so I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. You would like to be productive and have a good life, and that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great, you know, and you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. So that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is to plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss, and both of those work for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. But, you know, my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with. And you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people, because they don't like themselves very much. They're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating, and cracking the whip and then procrastinating. And it's like, God, it's so boring and such a pathetic way of spending your time. And you know what that's like, because you probably waste like 6 hours a day. What you do now is going to multiply its effects in the future. So, and you need to know what your damn time is worth. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, what if I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is, if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibility-less bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. Someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And you know, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face.
Okay, well, so that's another issue in some sense that seems to make the postmodernist critique even more correct. How in the world are you going to extract out a canonical interpretation of something like that? It's like it's not possible. But here's the issue, as far as I can tell. So the postmodernists extended that critique to the world. They said, look, well, a text is complicated enough. You can't extract out a canonical interpretation. What about the world? The world's way more complicated than a text, and so there's an infinite number of ways that you can look at the world. And so how do we know that any one way is better than any other way? And that's a good question. Now, the postmodern answer was, we can't. And that's not a good answer, because you drown in chaos under those circumstances, right? You can't make sense of anything. And that's not good, because it's not neutral to not make sense of things. It's very anxiety-provoking. It's very depressing, because if things are so chaotic that you can't get a handle on them, your body defaults into emergency preparation mode, and your heart rate goes up, and your immune system stops working, and like you burn yourself out. You age rapidly because you're surrounded by nothing you can control. That's an existential crisis, right? It's anxiety-provoking and depressing, very hard on people. And even more than that, it turns out that the way that we're constructed neurophysiologically is that we don't experience any positive emotion unless we have an aim and we can see ourselves progressing towards that aim. It isn't precisely attaining the aim that makes us happy. As you all know, if you've ever attained anything, because as soon as you attain it, then the whole little game ends. Then you have to come up with another game, right? So it's Sisyphus. And that's okay, but it does show that the attainment can't be the thing that drives you, because it collapses the game. That's what happens when you graduate from university. It's like you're king of the mountain for one day, and then you're like surf at Starbucks for the next 5 years, you know? So, yeah. So what happens is that human beings are weird creatures, because we're much more activated by having an aim and moving towards it than we are by attainment. And what that means is you have to have an aim, and that means you have to have an interpretation. And it also means that the nobler the aim, that's one way of thinking about it, the better your life. And that's a really interesting thing to know, because, you know, you've heard ever since you were tiny that you should act like a good person, and you shouldn't lie, for example. And you might think, well, why the hell should I act like a good person, and why not lie? I mean, even a 3-year-old can ask that question, because smart kids learn to lie earlier, by the way. And they think, well, why not twist the fabric of reality so that it serves your specific short-term needs? I mean, that's a great question. Why not do that? Why act morally? If you can get away with something, and it brings you closer to something you want, well, why not do it? These are good questions. It's not self-evident. Well, it seems to me tied in with what I just mentioned. It's like, you destabilize yourself and things become chaotic. That's not good. And if you don't have a noble aim, then you have nothing but shallow, trivial pleasures, and they don't sustain you.
And that's not good because life is so difficult, it's so much suffering, it's so complex. It ends and everyone dies and it's painful. It's like without a noble aim, how can you withstand any of that? You can't. You become desperate, and once you become desperate, things go from bad to worse very rapidly when you become desperate. And so there's the idea of the noble aim, and it's not something, it's something that's necessary. It's the bread that people cannot live without, right? That's not physical bread. It's the noble aim. And what is that? Well, it was encapsulated in part in the story of Marduk. It's to pay attention. It's to speak properly. It's to confront chaos. It's to make a better world. It's something like that. And that's enough of a noble aim so that you can stand up without, cringing at the very thought of your own existence, so that you can do something that's worthwhile to justify your wretched position on the planet. So now the literary issue is that, so look, you take a text, you can interpret it a variety of ways, but that's not right. This is where the postmodernists went wrong, because what you're looking for in a text, and in the world for that matter, is sufficient order and direction. So then we have to think, well, what does sufficient order and direction means? Well, you don't want to suffer so much that your life is unbearable, right? That just seems self-evident. Pain argues for itself. I think of pain as the fundamental reality because no one disputes it, right? I mean, even if you say that you don't believe in pain, it doesn't help when you're in pain. You still believe in it, right? You can't pry it up with logic and rationality. It just stands forth as what the fundament of existence, and that's actually quite useful to know. Say, well, you don't want any more of that than is absolutely necessary. And I think that's self-evident. And then you say, wait a minute, it's more complicated than that. You don't want any more of that that's necessary today, but also not tomorrow and not next week and not next month and not next year. So however you act now, better not compromise how you're going to be in a year, because that would just be counterproductive. That's part of the problem with short-term pleasures, right? It's like act in haste, repent at leisure. Everyone knows exactly what that means. So you have to act in a way that works now and tomorrow and next week and next month and so forth. And so you have to take your future self into account. And human beings can do that. And taking your future self into account isn't much different than taking other people into account, right? Because I remember there's this Simpson episode, and Homer downs a quart of mayonnaise and vodka. And he says, Marge says, you shouldn't really do that. And Homer says, that's a problem for future Homer. I'm sure glad I'm not that guy.
And I would say, you don't just have to face the reality of unjust suffering and death in your life. You have to face the reality of hell. And you might say, well, I don't believe in hell. It's like, well, do you believe in Nazi Germany? Do you believe in the Stalinist Soviet Union or Maoist China or Cambodia? That's hell. And you can assess that more deeply. You could say, well, that's not even hell. That's not as precise a formulation of hell as you might be able to conceptualize. Hell is actually participation in the process that led to the establishment of those countries. And that's something that human beings do. And the fact that we do that is something we have to face. And maybe that's even worse than death. And I think you can make a case for that. I really do. I think there are things in life that are worse than death. There are things in life that are worse than unjust suffering and death. And the things that lead to hell are worse. And you might think, well, I don't have to worry about that. It's like, yeah, you do, as a matter of fact, because you're going to face those things too. And you're going to face that when you face your own malevolence, which you will, and you're going to face that when you face the malevolence of others, including the mob. And some of that's just death and tragedy, and some of it is something far darker and deeper than that. And so, yeah, you face that. And so that's kind of interesting. And then you might think, well, how should you face that? And that's where Tammy's story is relevant. It's like, well, so she went and swam with the sharks. And I wasn't very happy about that because our life has been adventurous enough. I thought, do you really need to go swim with the sharks? And the answer seemed to be, well, that would be an adventure. And you know, I don't interfere with her when she's having an adventure. She's going to go have an adventure. It's far be it for me to interfere. And then she told me, you know, that you had to look the shark in the eye or it would think you're prey. Think, well, what do you have to look in the eye so you're not prey? And you know, human beings have been trying to figure that out for a long time because we're strange animals, because we're predators, but we're also prey. And so I guess at any moment you're sort of deciding, well, are you a predator? Are you the thing that's on top, or are you prey? And you're prey if you turn tail and run. And there's a psychological truth there, like a deep psychological truth. And it seems to be something like, if you practice forthright and voluntary exposure to that which terrifies and dismays you, it transforms you. And we really know this as psychologists. We even know there's more and more evidence suggesting, for example, that if you imagine you adopt this attitude of voluntary confrontation, that changes you psychophysiologically. So much of the biochemistry of motivation and emotion is transformed when you take a stressor which could be oppressive and paralyze you and cause you to withdraw, and you reverse that and you decide to advance. It's like a different spirit inhabits you. And I mean this physiologically. There's a whole different pattern of being that makes itself manifest in you neurologically and psychophysiologically and pharmacologically. So you take it on as a challenge, right? And that transforms you at a cellular level too, because one of the things we've discovered in recent years is that if you do something new and complex, then that turns on that parts of your DNA that haven't produced proteins before will start producing new proteins and reconstruct you from the cellular level up. So it's a deep transformation. We have no idea how deep. And again, you could ask yourself, if you didn't withdraw in fear from anything from everything that life threw at you, who could you become? And I would say that's the central religious question in some real deep sense. You know, are more things thrown at us than we can manage? Well, that's a tricky question, because pretty dreadful things are thrown our way. And you might say, well, that just presents an insuperable barrier to progress. That's not very helpful, because you're alive, here you are, you got these problems to contend with, and if it's an impossible task, then how could you be anything but hopeless and desperate? But then you think, well, wait a second, how would things transform if I took this on as a voluntary adventure? You know, regardless of its scope, and the scope would include unjust suffering, death, and hell. And that's not just some religious or metaphysical vision. It's like, no, you're actually going to have to contend with that in your life, in whatever way those things make themselves manifest to you personally. That's coming, man. And so maybe you better get prepared. And then the question might be, well, what would happen if you got prepared? And the answer might be, you'd be prepared. And I think the religious enterprise, in its deepest sense, is that process of preparation. And you know, you might want to even push that a bit farther. You might say, well, not only do you want to get prepared for what's coming your way, but you want to be so prepared that when it comes your way, that it doesn't make you bitter and resentful and tempted by the desire to walk the path that would make all of that even worse. And so you might say, well, if you could really face up to what you need to face up to, not only could you turn yourself into someone that could bear the catastrophe of life and exposure to hell, but maybe you could turn yourself into someone who would still do good even while facing those things. And that's a pretty noble goal, you know, because it's realistic. It's not naive at all. It says, look, man, you know, trouble's coming your way, and it's real. And yet it's possible that you could confront that and still do good in the deepest sense. It's like, well, that's quite something. would be really quite something if that's true. And one of the preconditions of that, well, one of the preconditions of that would be faith, I suppose. And in some sense, that's what Tammy was manifesting when she went down and swam with the sharks. Faith that if she looked the bloody predator in the eye, that would solve the problem. And then you think too, well, could it be any other way? It's like, well, we have all these problems in our lives, and we could think there's two possible ways of approaching those problems. One would be we just ignore them in the hopes they would what, go away? Well, that, and no one thinks that's, no one who isn't a child thinks that, and very few children. Nobody believes that. We know perfectly well that if you got to face something, man, you better face it. And if you're going to face it, that's probably the best pathway forward. And then you might think, well, what does that mean ultimately? And it might mean something like, face it, you know, as deeply as you possibly can and as voluntarily as you possibly can. And there's an element of faith in that because you have to put yourself on the line. But you're kind of stuck with that anyways. You know, that's the rub.
But the young men really need to hear this more, I think, is that you should be a monster. You know, because everyone says, well, you should be harmless, virtuous. You shouldn't do anyone any harm. You should sheath your competitive instinct. You shouldn't try to win. You know, you don't want to be too aggressive. You don't want to be too assertive. You want to take a back seat and all of that. It's like, no. Wrong. You should be a monster, an absolute monster, and then you should learn how to control it. If you're harmless, you're not virtuous. You're just harmless. You're like a rabbit. A rabbit isn't virtuous. It just can't do anything except get eaten. It's not virtuous. If you're a monster and you don't act monstrously, then you're virtuous. But you also have to be a monster. Well, you see this all the time. Harry Potter's like that too. It's like he's flawed, he's hurt, he's got evil in him. He can talk to snakes, man. He breaks rules all the time. All the time. He's not obedient at all. But, you know, he has a good reason for breaking the rules. And if he couldn't break the rules, him and his little clique of rule-breaking, you know, troublemakers, if they didn't break the rules, they wouldn't attain the highest goal. So it's very peculiar, but it's a very, 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 very common mythological notion. You know, the hero has to be a monster, but a controlled monster. Batman is like that, you know. I mean, it's everywhere. It's the story you always hear. Someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And you know, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face. If you're going to be a fighter, you have to want to win. And you have to want to hurt people. I mean, not for the sake of hurting them. That's what makes you different than an evil person. But you have to have that capacity. You have to develop that. And, you know, that's the step on the way to enlightenment, weirdly enough, because that isn't what people think.
People have been fed this diet of pablum, rights and impulsive freedom for so long. There's just an absolute starvation for the other side of the story. There are no rights, technically speaking, without responsibilities. And all we've had for 60 years is a dialogue about rights. Well, that leaves a hole on the other side of the story. And it's a hole that's in people's hearts, essentially. Because responsibility, well, perhaps that's not more important than rights. Like I said, they're part and parcel of the same formula. But it's in responsibility that most people find the meaning that sustains them through life. It's not in happiness. It's not in impulsive pleasure. Those things blow away at the first ill wind. But to adopt the responsibility for your own well-being, and to try to put your family together, and to try to serve your community, and to try to seek for eternal truths and to live them, that's the sort of thing that can ground you in your life enough so that you can withstand the difficulty of life. And when you tell people that, especially when you include yourself in the audience, let's say, and you're not finger waving from above, then everyone knows that it's true. There's been this attempt to identify masculine competence and power, let's say, but mostly competence with tyranny, and that's very, very hard on young men. It's also hard on young women, for that matter, but it's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world, because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak. They're weak. And life is a very difficult process, and you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like, those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order, right? And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. It's like, that's a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea, because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life. You can't bear any responsibility. You'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous. You don't treat adult men as if they're infants.
You most want to find will be found where you least want to look. There's this old story that's from King Arthur, and King Arthur has these knights, right? They all sit around a round table, which means they're roughly equal. That's what the round table means. And they're off to find the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail is the most valuable object. That's what it means. So they're off to find the most valuable thing, but they don't know what it is, and they don't know where it is. But they know that there's a most valuable thing, so in some sense it's akin to them orienting themselves by the star. And they don't know where to look, and so what they decide is, they have the castle, it's the middle of a forest, and so each knight decides to start looking for the Holy Grail by entering the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And so what's the idea there? Well, imagine there are things that come easy to you and that you're fond of pursuing, and that you're happy about pursuing. So you've found those and pursued them, and you've mastered them. So you know all that, but then there's another place that you don't want to go. And so you haven't gone there, and you haven't mastered it, and you're very small in comparison to it because you haven't mastered it. And so it has this monstrous aspect. If what you're doing isn't working, it's where you haven't gone that you need to go. And so I can give you another example of this. So let's say you're an agreeable person, and so you don't like conflict and you won't stand up for yourself, and you regard anger and the proclivity to provoke and to engage in conflict as something that's positively terrible. It's not only that you're not good at it, it's actually that it's wrong. So that's where you have to go if you're going to learn how to stand up for yourself. And imagine that you're afraid. Maybe you have something like agoraphobia. And so there's a whole bunch of things that you're afraid of, and you don't want to go there. But if you want to put yourself together, then that's exactly where you have to go. And so it's frequently the case that what you want to find is to be found where you least want to find it. And that idea is echoed in the prominent stories of dragons and gold. It's exactly the same idea. The dragon is this terrible thing. It's this terrible predatory thing that lives forever and is very, very wise. And it lives underground, and it'll kill you. It'll burn you up in a second. But it hoards gold. And so you have to go there into the dragon's lair if you're going to get the gold. And that's a representation of people's paradoxical relationship with reality. It's like you have to go out there and confront it in order to incorporate what it has to offer to you. But the probability that that's going to be intensely dangerous and push you right to the limit, first of all, those are actually the same thing. If it didn't push you to the limit, you wouldn't gain anything valuable from it. So you don't get one without the other. You don't get the gold without the dragon. That's a very strange, very, very strange idea. But it seems to be accurate. So all of that's lurking underneath this, in this imagery of the whale. Now, the whale, you can think of the story of Jonah. What happens with Jonah is that, roughly speaking, he's a prophet, and God tells him that he has to go to this city and straighten it out because it's veered off the path and it's heading towards doom. And Jonah thinks, I'm not going to that city to tell those people anything like that because they're not going to be very happy with me just showing up there and telling them, everything they're doing wrong. And so he hops on a boat and tries to get out of there. And then God conjures up this huge storm, and the boat is about to be swamped, and Jonah admits that it's actually his fault because God's upset with him because he got this direct command to go straighten out the city, and he ran off. And so they're not happy about this, but they throw Jonah overboard, and the sea's calm, and great fish comes up, a whale, and swallows him. And then he's down in the fish for 3 days, and it throws him up on the dry land, and then he's learned his lesson by that time, and he goes off to pursue his proper destiny. So that's echoed in this story as well, that if you don't follow the pathway that you're supposed to follow, the seas will become stormy for you, and something will come up and pull you down, and you'll be in a terrible place for some length of time till you learn your lesson. And if you're lucky, you'll get spit back up on shore, and then you can go do what you should do. Well, that's not a lesson that anybody needs to have interpreted. I think everybody understands that.
Part of spiritual development is to recognize the satanic tendencies that characterize you, and to fully wrestle with them and to integrate them. That's the thing. It's not so much to cast them away, it's to transmute them. And you can see the difference between people who've done that and people who haven't, at least to some degree, because people who haven't integrated the shadow at all are naive. And you can tell that when you look at them, and you can tell that when you talk to them. And because they're naive, they're often resentful as well because they get taken advantage of. And someone who's integrated that more, they're dangerous in the martial arts sort of way, which is they're dangerous, but they don't have to use it because their presence radiates implicit potential for havoc, and that's really necessary. It's one of the things that gives people self-respect.
Most creative people fail at producing their creative product and monetizing it, right? So your default position, if you're a creative person, is you're going to fail. And so, and that's because it's hard to come up with something new, and it's hard to present it to the market at the right time, and it's hard to market it. Like, those things are really, really difficult. And so what successful entrepreneurs do is they just keep doing it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And eventually, if they're fortunate, one of their ideas happens to hit the right place at the right time. And so that's also Darwinian in some sense. You know, you're creating all these little enterprises that are sort of alive. They're run by people, after all. And even if your idea is good, that doesn't mean it will be successful. There's so many things that have to be taken into account. So this is partly why persistence, and that's part of conscientiousness, is so useful. It's like, you know, what do they say? If at first you fail, then try again. And that would probably mean try something different rather than the same thing. But persistence is helpful because it enables you to run many, many experiments. And you need to know that the baseline is failure. You know, it's important, because otherwise you'll blame that on yourself. You know, and some of that's useful because there's probably some things that you could improve about yourself. But it's very difficult to go from 0 to 1, you know. If you're starting out as a salesperson, for example, the hardest sale is the first customer. And then, you know, they get easier with each additional customer. You got to know that there are differences in intelligence. It's really important. If you go into a job and you're not smart enough for that job, you're going to have one bloody miserable time. And you're going to make life wretched for the people around you because you won't be able to handle the position. But what you really want to do, as far as I can tell, if you want to maximize your chances for both success and let's say well-being, is you want to find a strata of occupation in which you would have an intelligence that would put you in the upper quartile. That's perfect. Then you're a big fish in a small pond. And you don't want to be the stupidest guy in the room. It's a bloody rough place to be. So, and you probably don't want to be the smartest guy in the room either, because what that probably means is you should be in a different room. If you want to be the best at what you're doing, bar none, then having an IQ of above 145 is a necessity, and maybe you're pushing 160 in some situations, and maybe that's making you one person in 10,000 or even one person in 100,000. And then also, to really be good at it, you probably have to be reasonably stress tolerant and also somewhat conscientious.
There's nothing you can possibly do to become more deadly than to improve your facility with language. And the way you do that is by reading, especially great things, and by writing, and by thinking, and by speaking, for that matter. But how could that not be viewed as absolutely central to what education is about? You want to be inarticulate and stumble over everything that you try to think and communicate? Yeah. How are you going to get anywhere? You don't even know who you are under those circumstances. You're this massive feeling that's expressing itself, you know, maybe in violence because you can't find the words. And you stumble around and bump into things, and you're clunky and dull, and you're not witty. You don't sparkle. It's from the uphill climb that we derive our value, and I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, you want a goal that you can never attain. So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month, and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal, but then you think, now I'm there, now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave what do you want to be, a giant infant with a gold bottle? You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck? It's like, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand. And that's dynamic, that's exciting.
One of the rules, I think it's rule 4, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win. The possibility that you can make yourself slightly better on a continual basis is, I think that's something that's accessible to everyone. I think that's equivalent to leading a virtuous life. And there is something to be said for virtue and truth, you know, and that is one thing. Another thing that I've noticed about people who've been phenomenally successful is that they really do everything they can to live a truthful life. And you can get a bloody long ways by being honest. Lay a disciplinary structure on yourself. Get the chaos in check. And then you can move towards a state that's freer. It's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. And so virtually every freedom that you have in life that's true freedom is purchased at the price of discipline.
But it's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you as in need of repair, that you could repair, then hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. Now, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial. You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do, hands down.
People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. What, do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle, and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile.
You don't know what's possible. And you're not as much as you could be. And so God only knows what you could do and have and give if you sacrificed everything to it. And that's the reason Abraham is constantly making sacrifices. And it's archaic, right? He's burning up like baby lambs, but like, well, they're alive, you know, that's something. And they're valuable, and that's something. You have to admit, even if you think about it as a modern person, that the act of sacrificing something might have some dramatic compulsion to it. You know, to go out into a flock and to take something that's newborn and to cut its throat and to bleed it and to burn it might be a way of indicating to yourself that you're actually serious about something. And it isn't so obvious that we have rituals of seriousness like that now. And so it's not so obvious that we're actually serious about anything. And so maybe that's not such a good thing. And so maybe we shouldn't be thinking that these people were so archaic and primitive and superstitious. It's possible that they knew something that we don't. And certainly in the Abrahamic stories, one of the things that maintains Abraham's covenant with God is his continual willingness to sacrifice. And it's so that sacrificial issue is so important, because you are not committed to something unless you're willing to sacrifice for it. Commitment and sacrifice are the same thing. And I think it borders on miraculous that those concepts are embedded into this narrative at the level of dramatic action, you know, instead of abstract explanation. People are acting this out. And the fundamental conception is so profound that it's really quite awe-inspiring. It's breathtaking, really, when you understand what message is trying to be conveyed. You have to make sacrifices. And what do you have to sacrifice? You have to sacrifice that which is most valuable to you currently that's stopping you. And God only knows what that is. It's certainly the worst of you. It's certainly that. And God only knows to what degree you're in love with the worst of you. So you move from the unbearable present to the ideal future, and you can't help that. You have to live in a structure like that. That's your house. That's another way of thinking about it. And if you want to get your house in order, and if you want it to be a place that you can live properly, then you have to plan the future that is perfect. And then I think, well, what does that mean? And it means it's good for you. Right? And one of the things that I do all the time with my clinical and consulting clients is try to figure out what would be good for them. But we do more than that. We try to think, okay, well, how can we set this up so it's really good for you, and that all the side consequences of that are things that are good for other people. And so, because people are often also timid about trying to get something that's good for themselves because they feel that it's selfish or that they don't deserve it. So we set it up so that, well, look, we're going to set it up so that it's plainly obvious that this will not harm the structure of the universe. For you to have what you need and to do it in a way that's of benefit to other people, there's no downside to that. And so it's okay. It's okay if you reach out and take that. And one of the things that's interesting about the biblical stories, the Abrahamic stories as well, is that God doesn't really seem to be opposed to the success of the people that he's chosen. You know, what happens to them is as they progress through their journey is they get larger flocks, and they get more authority, and they get life more abundant. That's what happens. God doesn't seem to be a miser in the Old Testament. It's like if you put in the effort and you accept the covenant and you make the sacrifices, then you get to be successful, and maybe successful beyond your wildest dreams. And that's actually seems to be okay with God, and that's pretty cool given that, you know, that general notion of. But again, it seems to me that that's very good news, and that you also don't have to be perfect in order to have that happen. And then the other thing, this is the issue about going into the unknown. It's like, well, if you leave your country and your kin and your father's house, and you go out into a land that your intuition guides you to, you're going to undergo these radical transformations. This is a sacrificial transformation too, because you're moving forthrightly and voluntarily into chaos. Right? And that's the same as the dragon fight. That's the hero's story. And what will happen there is that you will transform yourself. And so the call to an ideal is also the call to a sequence of deaths and rebirths that move you closer and closer to the ideal.
We were sitting in the first row of the plane, and do you remember the guy was a young black man, sort of ran onto the plane. He was wearing a yellow vest. He was a worker working the bridge or something. And he came up to you and he said, I'm not supposed to be on the plane right now. I'm not supposed to say anything. but you helped me turn my life around. I got this job because of you. And what I remember more than anything else is he had this huge smile on his face. But it wasn't because you told him to go out there and be happy. It was because you told him to go out there and fix some stuff. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about right now.
Those experiences are so life-sustaining. It's so remarkable to have that happen, and that's something I've been immensely privileged to constantly experience, although there's also something about it that's extremely painful. You know, the magnitude of that joy is sort of proportional to the obstacles it had to overcome while it was attempting to manifest itself. You know, and one of the things I'm sure you saw on the tour, and I don't know how this affected you, was the depth of hunger for encouragement that exists everywhere, as far as I can tell. And everyone wants to be appreciated when they bring their best to the table. That's why the current assault on merit is so unbelievably brutal, because it will deny everyone the right to be appreciated for being their best. And well, you might ask, well, when does the best become your enemy? And that's easy. It's when you flee from it.
And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how will you say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? Well, you might be wondering what a beam is, and a mote is a dust speck, and a beam is a very large piece of lumber. And so the issue is not so much the blindness of others, even though there's as much blindness among others as there is for you. But the issue here, the advice here, the description here is, you should be concerned about what's interfering with your own vision first. And you should leave other people the hell alone in relationship to that. And so if your mode of being in the world is, if you would just act better, things would improve for me, or if you identify the evil and the catastrophe as something that's outside, that someone else needs to fix, or that someone else is responsible for, then you're not going to fix that. And you're going to remain blind to the things that you're doing and not doing that make things not go well. And so it's just better to think, all right, I'm probably blind in many, many ways. And maybe there are some ways that I could rectify that, because it's highly probable that you're blind in all sorts of ways. I mean, in fact, it's virtually certain. And so it's just more useful to think, how is it that I'm wrong in this situation? I'll tell you something that I learned to do when I was arguing with my wife, which happened quite frequently, because when you actually communicate with people, you find out that there's many things that you don't agree on, and that's because you're actually different creatures. And so if you're actually going to have a truthful conversation, then you're going to find out that you don't see things the same way, and then you can either pretend that that's not the case and gloss over it and then end up in a 30-year silent war, or you can have the damn fight when you need to have it and see if you can straighten it out. So now and then we'd get in a situation where we were at loggerheads, we couldn't move. And, you know, it would spiral up into hate speech, let's say. Because, yeah, everyone laughs because they know they manifest plenty of hate speech towards those they love. So one of the things we learned to do was, when we hit an impasse, was to separate and to go our own ways, and to go sit and think, okay, look, we're at this unpleasant situation. We can't figure out how to move forward. I'd always think, of course it's her fault. Obviously it's her fault. At least 95%. But maybe there was something I did that contributed like 5% to it. And so I would sit and think and ask myself a question, which was, is there anything I did in the last 6 months that increased the probability that this impasse would manifest itself? And I'll tell you, you have no idea how fast your mind will generate an answer to a question like that. Because there's undoubtedly some idiotic thing that you did, that you know, that you remember, that increased the probability that you're going to have your hands around the throat of the person that you love. And then you can go tell them that. And then you can have a conversation, especially if they do the same thing. Say, look, you know, here's how I'm an idiot in this situation. And the other person says, well, yeah, here's how I'm an idiot. And then you're two idiots, and then maybe you can have a conversation. So, thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam of out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote of thy brother's eye. That's, hey, hard to argue with that. Ask and it shall be given you. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. That sounded pretty optimistic again. But again, I think it's a description of the structure of existential reality, and by which I mean, when I'm in my clinical practice and I observe, and this is also the case with my students, is let's say, people's lives aren't what they would like them to be. And so then you ask, why? Well, forget about tragedy and catastrophe, because that's self-evident, and we're not going to discuss that. Although the degree to which you bring about your own tragedy is always indeterminate. But I would never say that every terrible thing that is visited on a person is something they deserved. I think that that's a very dangerous presupposition, especially because everyone gets sick and everyone dies. But one of the main reasons that people don't get what they want is because they don't actually figure out what it is. And the probability that you're going to get what would be good for you, let's say, which would even be better than what you want, right? Because, you know, you might be wrong about what you want easily. But maybe you could get what would really be good for you. Well, why don't you? Well, because you don't try. You don't think, okay, here's what I would like if I could have it. And I don't mean in a way that you manipulate the world to force it to deliver you goods for status or something like that. That isn't what I mean. I mean something like, imagine that you were taking care of yourself like you were someone you actually cared for. And then you thought, okay, I'm caring for this person. I would like things to go as well for them as possible. What would their life have to be like in order for that to be the case? Well, people don't do that. They don't sit down and think, all right, you know, let's figure it out. You've got a life. It's hard, obviously. It's like 3 years from now, you can have what you need. You've got to be careful about it. You can't have everything. You can have what would be good for you, but you have to figure out what it is, and then you have to aim at it. Well, my experience with people has been if they figure out what it is that would be good for them, and then they aim at it, then they get it. And it's strange because they don't it's a strange thing. It's not quite that simple because, you know, you may formulate an idea about what would be good for you, and then you take 10 steps towards that, and you find out that your formulation was a bit off, and so you have to reformulate your goal. You know, so you're kind of going like this as you move towards the goal. But a huge part of the reason that people fail is because they don't ever set up the criteria for success. And so, since success is a very narrow line and very unlikely, the probability that you're going to stumble on it randomly is 0. And so there's a proposition here, and the proposition is, if you actually want something, you can have it. Now the question then would be, well, what do you mean by actually want? And the answer is that you reorient your life in every possible way to make the probability that that will occur as certain as possible. And that's a sacrificial idea, right? It's like, you don't get everything. Obviously. But maybe you can have what you need. And maybe all you have to do to get it is ask. But the asking isn't a whim or today's wish. It's like, you have to be deadly serious about it. You have to think, okay, like, I'm taking stock of myself. And if I was going to live properly in the world and I was going to set myself up such that being would justify itself in my estimation, and I don't mean as a harsh judge, exactly what is it that I would aim at? Well, one of the things I've found is that in test of this theory, let's say, you could try this. This is a form of prayer, knocking. Sit on your bed one day and ask yourself, what remarkably stupid things am I doing on a regular basis to absolutely screw up my life? And if you actually ask that question, but you have to want to know the answer, right? Because that's actually what asking the question means. It doesn't mean just mouthing the words. It means you have to decide that you want to know. You'll figure that's out so fast it'll make your hair curl. It's as if Jung thought about this. He thought that people had two poles of consciousness, and one was the individual consciousness that we each identify with, and the other was something he called the self, and the self is you might think about it as the divine within. That's a close enough approximation. It's the universal part of your consciousness. It's your conscience. That's another way of thinking about it, whatever your conscience is. But it's something that you can consult. It's like the Socratic daemon. Socrates said that the thing that made him different than everyone else in Greece was that he consulted his daemon, his genius. He asked himself how it was that he should conduct himself in the world, and then he did that, whatever it was. He didn't try to force a solution, he didn't try to force a solution selfishly. He asked, I'm going to manifest myself in the best possible manner in the world. I would like to do that. What would that be? Well, you're perfectly capable of thinking. God only knows how. You're perfectly capable of immense feats of imagination and dream and fantasy. God only knows how you do all of that. What would happen if you consulted yourself about the best possible outcome for you? You might get an answer. Well, that's what this proposition is.
The Greeks had the maxim, know thyself. How do we come to know ourselves in terms of our personalities and, more importantly, potential? Well, one of the first ways to come to know yourself is to understand that you don't. You can learn to kind of watch yourself like you're watching a stranger. You have to adopt a position. It's a position of radical humility, I would say. Humility in two senses. So one sense would be the humility of recognizing your ignorance. So you have to understand that you don't know who you are. That's not easy to understand because you think you know. But then, you remember you can't control yourself very well. You're not very disciplined. You're full of flaws. Maybe you don't know yourself as well as you think. But it's hard to get low enough to understand how deeply it is the case that you are ignorant about who you are. Now, there's an upside to that too, which also is that you're also ignorant about who you could be. And so the discovery of that, is some reward for the horror of determining who you actually are. And then I would say, well, then you watch yourself. You watch yourself like you're watching a stranger. You watch what you say and you listen. You think, well, what sort of person would say that? And how am I reacting emotionally when I'm communicating in that manner? Is that making me feel stronger or weaker? Is it filling me with shame? Is it helping my confidence? Am I laying out a lie? Am I deceiving myself and other people? Am I adopting this personality at parties that is designed to impress and to amuse, and it comes across as nothing but self-centered narcissism? What are my dark fantasies? What are my aggressive fantasies? What is it that I'm willing to do? What am I interested in so that I'll spontaneously pursue it? What do I procrastinate about and why? What am I unwilling to do? What do I think is good? What do I congratulate myself for accomplishing? And what do I berate myself for failing to confront and to implement? Those are all incredibly complicated questions, and you don't know the answers to them. So that's a start. And then in terms of potential, well, you'll discover a little bit more about your potential as you discover who you are, especially the darker parts of yourself, because then you discover your potential for mayhem. There's some real utility in that. It's actually something that strengthens you, because the first thing that a realization like that can in fact produce is the ambition to incorporate that dangerousness into a higher order personality. And that can make you implacable. That can make you someone who can say no when you need to say no. That can make you someone who won't avoid necessary conflict. And so that's unbelievably useful. And so that's one of the potentials that you might discover. The other thing you do to discover your potential is you challenge yourself. It's like Rule 4 in my book, 12 Rules for Life, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And that's kind of a good way to start this. It's like, well, take a bit of a look at yourself and think about what's not so good that you could improve, that you should improve by your own standards, and that you would improve, and set yourself a little goal. Maybe you're not studying at all at your university, or maybe you're at work and you've got this stack of paper there, and you haven't looked at that damn stack for like a month, and you know that you should be, and you're bothering yourself at night because you're avoiding that. You think, well, I've avoided that stack of paper completely for 1 month. I'm quite a coward when it comes to whatever snakes might be hidden in that stack of paper. How about tomorrow I just put that stack of paper in front of me on my desk and I glance through it for 15 seconds. See if I can do that. It's like, well, you set yourself a goal of improvement. It's a humble goal, because really, are you such a coward that the best that you can bloody well manage after a month of avoidance is 15 seconds of exposure to a stack of paper? It could easily be. You've been avoiding it. You're obviously afraid of it. And so the situation could be that dismal and dire. And you might think, well, geez, it's no balm to my ego. It's not fostering the strength of my ego to recognize in myself someone who could only withstand 15 seconds of exposure to that thing I'm afraid of. And so that's a form of humility too. It's like, there's things you could do to improve, and you know what they are. And there's small steps that you could take, that you might take, that would put you in that direction. And then the question is, are you big enough to take those small steps? Are you capable of grappling with the fact that you're fundamentally flawed to the point where you have to break things down into almost childlike steps in order to manage them? And the answer to that is, yeah, you are. And that's the lot of, I don't know if it's the lot of everyone. Most people have things they avoid, and they're afraid of. So I would say to some degree, it's the lot of everyone. People vary in the degree to which they've conquered that. And you do meet people from time to time who are extraordinarily disciplined. But most of the time they've got disciplined in exactly this manner. It's through slow incremental improvement. And then you challenge yourself. It's like, well, could I do this? That would be better. Then you find out, and then you think, well, is there something slightly larger and more challenging that I could do that would be better? And you try it and you find out. And as you try it and you find out, generally you get better at it, and you can take on larger and larger challenges. You take responsibility for yourself. That's part of standing up straight with your shoulders back. It's like, take on the world, man, but only at the level that you can manage. When you're ignorant and biased and deeply flawed and immature, it's where everyone starts. You don't want to bite off more than you can chew, but it doesn't mean that you can't wrestle with part of reality. Some part that's small enough so that you have a good shot at victory. And to put yourself together, the first steps towards that is to allow yourself to be a fool, right? It's because you don't know what you're doing. You have to admit that. And there's going to be a loss of ego or destruction of ego, arrogant ego that necessarily accompanies that. But you need the loss of that arrogant ego, because it's precisely what's interfering with your movement forward. It's part of the adversarial process, mythologically speaking, that stops moral progress. You're too proud of who you think you are to notice what you're like so that you could change properly. You don't want to sacrifice that part of yourself. It's probably associated with some delusion that helps you maintain a positive, although very fragile self-image, in the absence of genuine effort. It's not to be recommended. You know yourself by watching and paying attention. It's watching like you're a snake. A snake watches like cold-bloodedly, with no emotional reaction, just to see what's there. It doesn't allow, symbolically speaking, doesn't allow what is wanted or desired to interfere with what is observed. So you watch yourself like that, as if you don't know who you are. Well, that's the beginning. And then you challenge yourself continually to see how far past yesterday you can push today and tomorrow, and to continually experiment with expanding the domains not only of your competence, but of your ability to increase that competence. And the upper limit to that is proportional to the moral effort that you put into it. The more that's guided by the highest of all possible visions, right? The alliance with the highest of all possible conceivable good. And the more it's accompanied by truth in speech and action, the more you will develop your potential. And you also, I suppose, have to be willing to undertake that as an adventure, because it's a hell of a thing to bear that kind of responsibility. It takes a person out of the ordinary. It takes them out of themselves. And there's an alienation and an isolation that goes along with that, and a great sorrow, all of that together. But there's deep meaning to be had in it, and there isn't anything better that you can do. So that's the answer to that question.
I don't know what the hell you should do with your life. I can help you figure it out, maybe. We can talk about it, but you are the person who has to decide if the things that you're aiming for, you know, get you out of bed in the morning. And then you got to specify the transformation processes and start practicing them. And you have to understand that you're going to be bad at it, but it doesn't matter, because bad's fine. Persistent is what you need to be. If you persist, with tiny improvements, if you persist, you win. It's direction that produces primary positive emotion. And so if you need positive emotion to move through life, which you do, because you can't even move without positive emotion, and also positive emotion is a good bulwark against terror and pain. If you need those things, then you need direction, you need a goal, you need a value structure. You let all that nonsense burn away. And you might say, well, I don't know what I should leave behind. And the answer to that is, that's a lie. All you have to do is ask yourself. You'll come up with a list instantly of 100 stupid things that you're doing that you know you could stop doing. Take on the consequences of error and learn from it, and then you win constantly, because even if something goes sideways, you think there's something to be derived from this. When you're in the world and something objects to you, something that matters objects to you, then in the entire unrealized world is in that thing that objects. It's all tangled up inside it. That's why it's the great dragon of chaos. It's everything that's outside of your conceptual structure. And what is that? It's everything that lurks outside of your walled city. And it's manifested itself like the snake in the garden. And the easiest thing to do is say, I'm not having anything to do with that. But the problem with that is, well, you get your C- and you don't do anything about it. Maybe you're a little bitter and more resentful, and your study habits get a little worse. So the next time you get like a D+, and then you collect a bunch of Fs, and then you stop going to school, and then you stop showering, right? Then you end up jumping off the bridge. And so that's how the dragon eats you when you don't pay attention to it. And so it's no bloody wonder that people avoid, you know. It's really no wonder that they avoid, because error messages contain within them the implicit world. Now, the upside of that is, well, they contain within them the implicit world. And the world isn't all negative. And so maybe you get your C-, and that's actually the best gift you ever got, because somebody finally took you and went, whack, you know, clue in. And so you take that apart and you think, oh, I don't know how to write. I don't know how to think. I've never read anything in my life. My study habits are abysmal, you know, like maybe I'm working at 2% efficiency, which it's like to find that out is so optimistic. I mean, if you're barely hanging in there, but you're only working at 2%, you might imagine what you could have as a life if you're working at like 50%. So the C- can be the best gift you ever had, and that's the gold that the dragon hoards. That's exactly what that means. That doesn't prove that you're stupid. Now, it implies that you might be stupid, but it doesn't, right, really, it does, and that's why you don't want to look at it. Maybe it implies that you're lazy, or implies that you're ignorant, or like it implies all sorts of terrible, but you don't want to leap to that, and that's sort of the proclamation of innocence before guilt. You are the thing that is, and you're the thing that becomes, and you should put the thing that becomes at a higher place than the thing that is. That means you also have to allow yourself to shake off those things about you that you might be pathologically attached to, habits and people for that matter, ways of thinking, all of those things. You have to allow yourself to shake those off, and that's more like a burning That's why the phoenix is the symbol that it is, right? It's old and it deteriorates, it bursts into flame, and then it's reborn. It's like, well, do you want to be reborn? It's like, well, that's not the question. The question is, do you want to burst into flame? And the answer to that generally is no. But that's the wrong answer. The right answer is you let all that nonsense burn away. And so then you look at the micro routines. It's okay, well, I got a C- in this course. Maybe I should study for that course 15 minutes more a day for the next 3 months. And then you ask yourself, do you think you could do that? No, I'm too useless. Okay, how about 15 minutes every second day? You think you could do that? You put it in your schedule, like 15 minutes every second day in the morning. And that's while you think, well, what's wrong with me? Well, I'm not very good at managing my study schedule. That's not quite down here at the behavioral level, but it's pretty close, because what you can take an action. You can open up your schedule and you can say, well, I'll mark 15 minutes aside. Then you can practice doing that. It's pretty low level in the hierarchy. It means, well, you're still not a horrible person. You just got to polish up your work ethic. It's like, shut the hell up most of the time. But now and then you don't shut up because it's time to say something. You don't want to make unnecessary enemies, though. Well, you don't want to take yourself apart any more than is absolutely necessary. Develop some of the micro routines on the other side of the personality distribution. So if you're disagreeable as hell, maybe you could start learning how to do nice things for people. And that actually works, by the way. So if you take disagreeable people who are depressed and you get them doing nice things for other people, their depression tends to lift. But then by the same token, if you're agreeable, then you should practice doing some things for yourself and being more tough-minded in your negotiation. You know, you're extroverted. It's like, okay, man, learn to spend some time with yourself, right? You're low in openness. Well, try reading a book that's outside of your, your sphere of interest now and then. If you're conscientious, well, you should probably learn how to relax occasionally, and so forth. So you can, I think partly what you're doing as you're developing your personality is not moving the mean much, the average, where you're located, but you're extending the standard deviation so that you're a bigger bag of tricks than you were before. Life has got its rat's nest of miseries, and that's for sure. And maybe you could even make a categorical statement that life is mostly a rat's nest of misery. And you can make a pretty powerful argument for that. But then there's a counter question, which is, well, what if you tried not to make it any more miserable than it had to be, right? Then what would it be like? I would suspect that most of that misery would go away, because it's the unnecessary misery that really brings you down. It's like, well, if someone has cancer, it's like, that sucks. But it's not like you can say, if only we had done this differently, then that wouldn't have happened. But when someone's out like torturing you in a malevolent way, or maybe you're doing the same, you can always ask yourself, well, is this really necessary? Is this just like a useless add-on to the miseries of life? That's what disheartens people. And so even in your own life, if you aren't suffering from self-imposed misery, and you're only suffering from inescapable misery, maybe you could handle that, and even maybe without becoming irredeemably corrupt. So the goal would be, well, yeah, life is a rat's nest of miseries, and maybe it has no ultimate meaning. We could say that if we're feeling particularly pessimistic, but it still leaves one question open, which is, if you didn't do everything you could to make it worse, how good could you make it be? And the least answer is, well, it could be tragedy, but maybe not hell.
You're sitting on the edge of the bed trying to have an honest dialogue with yourself, and the little voice says, it's pretty disgusting in here. And you think, well, I'm way above such trivial niceties as organizing my room. It's like, well, that's pride. That's arrogance. If you're above organizing what's actually yours, how in the world are you ever going to organize anything else? And so you get on your knees and you think, well, it's time to, take a brush to the toilet. And maybe that's where you start. And that works. That works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things that are wrong, you'll improve unbelievably rapidly.
There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of.
but you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much, well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you, right? And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze you and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video call, which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of it on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you. And you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit, and so you're a little stronger, and then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. You only have to ask a stupid question once. You ask a stupid question, and if you're in a crowd and you ask a stupid question, 80% of the people in the crowd have the same question. They're just too cowardly to ask. But you ask and then someone actually tells you, you never have to ask that question again. You're no longer stupid. What stupid thing am I doing that I could quit doing? That I would quit doing? Because those aren't the same thing, right? Because you know there's stupid things that you're doing that you're just not going to quit doing because you like them. But there might be something on the edge there where you could stop that. If you want to know something about yourself, sit on your bed one night and say to yourself, you got to mean this. Like, you got to be desperate. This is no game, this.
My life is not everything I want it to be, and perhaps it's not everything that I need it to be. And by need, I mean my life is so unbearable that the suffering that's attendant upon that has made me nihilistic, cynical, bitter, resentful, driving the proclivity to see evil everywhere except within my own heart. Like, these are problems, man. And you ask yourself, you sit on the bed and say, okay, man, I'm ready to learn something. What's one thing I'm doing wrong that I know I'm doing wrong that I could fix, that I would fix? It's like, you meditate on that, you'll get an answer. And it won't be one you want, but it'll be the necessary one. You know, and it's often something that will point you to small things. Like, that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things you know that are wrong, you'll improve unbelievably rapidly. There's never been a better time for the majority of people to be alive. And the future, although we're vulnerable and terrible things can always happen to us, it's hard to make a case that the future doesn't look comparatively positive. We're becoming extremely technologically sophisticated, and the world is changing at an incredibly rapid rate, and the only way we're going to be able to manage that in a positive way is if each of us, or as many of us as possible, are capable of making wise and careful and truthful decisions. And if we do that, then maybe things can continue to improve. You don't get people to stand up on their own 2 feet and to adopt responsibility if everything is given to them. And that's a real conundrum.
There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much, well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day.
You're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them because they're not like you. You know, they don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win. Be careful who you share good news with, because you want to share good news with people who are going to be genuinely happy for you, and that's one way that you can identify those people who are totally on your side. Be careful who you share bad news with, because that's equally tricky. You know, you want someone who will listen to you when you're having trouble and allow you your grief, especially if it's a consequence of something tragic, and who won't try to one-up you, you know, because often when you're talking to people, they'll be thinking about what they have to say that's worse, and that's not helpful if you need a listening ear. Make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. I talked a lot already about the necessity of cleaning your room, which is, you know, in some sense a foolish piece of advice because it seems so obvious, but it's not obvious at all. And you'll find if you try it, especially if you're in a household that's not very functional, that you'll encounter obstacles that you couldn't imagine existed while you're trying to put your life in order. And you can take your surroundings beyond order and move towards beauty, and that's unbelievably useful.
One of the things that I've been so you know, there's lots of different ways to interpret the world, and you can maybe even make a case that there's an endless number of ways to interpret the world. And the problem with that is that it kind of disorients you in terms of what you should be doing. But
just because there's a very large number of ways to interpret the world doesn't mean there's a very large number of productive, meaningful, and sustainable ways to interpret the world. And one of the things you do have to do is figure out how you can conduct yourself today so that you don't upset the apple cart in a week or a month or a year. And so, you know, what you do in some sense psychologically is you admit to yourself that your current frame of reference is faulty. And then you start opening the door to a different kind of thinking, which is more creative thinking. It's more lateral thinking. Saying, well, I'm wrong, but that's not necessarily a problem because I could be right if I thought some other way. Well, you know, that's great. Often it works.
Yeah.
And there's almost no end to the utility of trying to figure out which ways that you're wrong.
Yeah.
Because there's lots of them. And every time you discover one, then you don't have to be quite so wrong anymore. That's a really good deal.
Yeah.
It's from the uphill climb that we derive our value, and I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, you want a goal that you can never attain. So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal, but then you think, now I'm there, now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave the face. What do you want to be, a giant infant with a gold bottle? You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck. It's like, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand. And that's dynamic, that's exciting. Lay a disciplinary structure on yourself, get the chaos in check, and then you can move towards a state that's freer. It's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. And so in virtually every freedom that you have in life that's true freedom is purchased at the price of discipline. That it's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you as in need of repair, that you could repair, then, hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. Now, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial. You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do, hands down. People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure, because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces.
Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. What, do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle, and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile. The great people I know are brutally truthful to themselves and other people, and they have insanely adventurous lives. Get rid of everything you say that you only say to impress other people, and just see if you can say what you believe to be true. That's an adventure. That's the thing about the truth, you know? Well, you got to ask yourself, if you're not speaking the truth, who is it that's talking? If you're saying something that you do not believe to be true, it's not you talking. It's something else. It might be the part of you that wants to manipulate the other person into delivering what you think you want from them. Well, what is that spirit of manipulation that you've allowed to possess you? It's not you. Let's say you decide to live your whole life in that instrumental manner. You're going to craft your words like the student who says, well, I'm going to write what the professor wants to hear so I get the grade. It's like, well, you just turn yourself into that. Well, who is it that's doing that manipulating? It's not you, because those aren't your words. So even if you get the grade, it's not you that got the grade. It's the false you. It's the manipulative you. So you do that your whole life. You don't have your life. And then you think, well, God, that was a miserable life. I manipulated everybody. They were so damn stupid. They were sucked in by it. They're all contemptible. Everyone does it, you know, which they don't, by the way. And so that's a pathway to bitterness. Partly because if you're a manipulator and you use your language falsely, you don't live your own life. You live the life of whatever possesses you when you think it's you manipulating. And so you live the life of the spirit of manipulation.
You know, maybe you're in California, see someone speeding down the road in a convertible Porsche, and you think, oh man, what a lucky bastard. And the truth of the matter is that he's thinking about wrapping his expensive sports car around the next cement pillar that he comes close to. You know, you can't tell. And people have hard lives, and even people who are comparatively fortunate have hard lives. And the ideal that you're observing that makes you jealous and resentful is in large part an illusion that's created by your own mind. You have to be careful of what you're jealous of, because you don't really know what it is. And then the other thing that's kind of useful is to understand you're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them, because they're not like you. They don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you.
I plan on taking my own life very soon. Why shouldn't I? Well, I'm going to assume this isn't a casual question, you know, that's being put out for the purposes of display.
Well, the first thing I would say is you have to think very carefully through the consequences of that for other people. So I've had clients in my clinical practice who never recovered from the suicide of a family member. Decades later, they're still torturing themselves about it. And so that's what you leave behind. Now, the problem is you might be dreaming about that, because maybe you're feeling that life has been twisted against you and that people deserve to suffer for the misery that they've imposed upon you. But I would say, think very, very carefully before you go down that route. It's a terrible thing to leave people with. And so part of the reason that suicide has been illegal in most societies is because it absolutely devastates the people you leave behind. And you might think, well, if you're really depressed, then maybe you're really depressed. That's a possibility. You might think, well, those people would be better off without me. It's like, and if you get really depressed, you can think that way, and you can even get to the point where you can't think any other way than that. And I would say, if you're at the point where you can't think any other way than that, then you should tell someone and you should go to the hospital. Because that can happen, it can happen if you get depressed. And there are treatments for depression, and many of them work. For some people, antidepressants work like mad. Now, they don't work for everyone, and I'm not claiming that they're a panacea, but they certainly beat the hell out of suicide, right? And even if they have some negative side effects, and sometimes they do, quite frequently they do, the negative side effects aren't fatal. It's like, well, there's the possibility that your condition is physical, that you're ill in some way, either physically or perhaps you have a psychological problem. Maybe you were hurt, or there's lots of reasons that people get depressed that are very, very complex. I would say don't give up hope and do something final before you've explored all possible options. And if you haven't talked to a psychologist, you haven't talked to a psychiatrist, you haven't tried antidepressants, you haven't revealed to your family or people that care for you that this is how you're feeling, then you owe it to yourself and them to explore every possible avenue before you take such a step. And then you don't want to deprive the world of what you can bring to the world. That's the other thing, you have intrinsic value, and you can't just casually bring that to an end. You leave a hole in the fabric of being itself. So, and a wise man that I once worked with said, he was a very strange person. He was a psychologist at the maximum security prison in Edmonton, and I worked with him for a while, briefly, very briefly, at the prison itself. And he said, you can always commit suicide tomorrow. And that's a very, it's a flippant statement in some sense, but he meant it in a very serious way. It's like, you only get to decide that once, and you can put it off. And so I would say just put it off, and then put it off some more, and then put it off some more, and see what you can do to put yourself together. You explore every possible option. And if you're so hopeless that you have a suicidal plan, which is a real sign of danger, if you really know how you would do it and you've thought it out, then I would say, tell someone for God's sake, tell them, or go to a hospital and tell them. And for sure, try antidepressants, but what the hell do you have to lose? So do everything you possibly can to address the issue before you do something like that. And do give some thought to the people that you're going to leave behind, because believe me, you may just absolutely wipe them out in a way that they will never recover from. You cannot fix someone's suicide. You're stuck with it. And you think you torture yourself for the rest of your life. If I would have only known, if I would have only said something different. This particular client talked to her relative, a sibling, who committed suicide, like 20 minutes before he committed suicide, probably after he took the pills. And she was kind of preoccupied because you don't know that the person at the other end is at the end of their tether. And she never forgave herself for not responding properly in that last phone call. That's a hell of a thing to leave someone with. And the final thing I would say is don't be so sure that your life is yours to take. You don't own yourself the way that you own an object. You have a moral obligation to yourself as a locus of divine value, let's say. You can't treat that casually. It's wrong. So those are the reasons. Explore everything you can explore to put yourself back on your feet. All the things. There's all sorts of treatments for depression. Don't leave people around you with that to suffer from for the rest of your lives. Don't underestimate your value in the world. And don't underestimate the fact that suicide is wrong.
And so those are 4 reasons why you shouldn't end your life soon, or at all, for that matter. So, our daughter ended her life at 24 due to depression. If someone is determined to end their life, how can one change their mind? Oh, well, first of all, I'm very sorry about that. That's a terrible thing. Look, I had this friend, sorry. There's been a lot of depression in our family, so it's a question that cuts close to the bone. Anyways, I had this friend, a friend of my parents, and her granddaughter committed suicide, you know. She was just beating herself up about that. What could have I done? What could have I done differently? This is the problem with suicide. It leaves everybody behind thinking, oh my God, what could have I done? I could have treated the person better. I could have listened. I could have been there. It's like, and she was just beating herself up about this, really feeling that she wasn't a useful person, that she'd failed as a grandmother. She's a really good person, you know. And so I went for a walk with her, and I said, and she's married, and she likes her husband, and he's a really good guy. And I said, look, you're blaming yourself for your granddaughter's suicide. It's like, are you blaming your husband? Are you sitting him down and telling him what a useless bastard he was as a grandfather because his granddaughter committed suicide and how he failed completely? She said, no, I'd never do that. So I said, well, don't do it to yourself. No. Depression is a terrible thing. And many, many, many things cause it, and we don't understand. We understand some of them, but lots of them we don't understand at all. You know, sometimes people get depressed because they're really sick. We know that depression can be an inflammatory disease. It might be associated with autoimmune dysfunction. There's lots of reasons that people get depressed, and depressed people can go places that are so dark you just cannot imagine it. And it isn't necessarily the case that you can always rescue someone, you know. But drowning yourself in the aftermath of a suicide is not helpful. So there's a good room for self-forgiveness there, you know. I mean, maybe you did some things you shouldn't have done that were reprehensible and all of that, but you don't want to beat yourself up. Remember the presumption of innocence, right? Innocent until proven guilty. And you have to apply that to yourself. I think there are times when people are so depressed that there isn't anything that anyone can do. You know, and the depressed person thinks, and this is probably the worst part of it, the depressed person thinks, everywhere I look, it's nothing but catastrophe. And I can't see any way out of it. I can't see any path forward whatsoever. And then they think as well, and maybe it's the combination of these two thoughts that really make people suicidal. It's like, it's hopeless. It isn't going to get any better. No matter where I turn, there's no escape. The suffering is unbearable. And I'm absolutely no use whatsoever to anyone. It would be better for everyone if I was just gone, because if I'm not so much of a burden now that it's going to destroy their life, then I'm going to be that much of a burden in the future. And so it's hard to imagine what that's like for people, but it's dreadful. And there's lots of ways you get there. And so you can listen to people. You can desperately encourage them to seek the help they need. You know, like I've seen antidepressants work miracles on very, very many people. Now, they don't work for everyone, and they're not a panacea, but, you know, they have side effects and all of that. But one of the side effects of untreated depression is that you kill yourself, and there is no recovery from that. And the probability is actually rather high. So you can go to war with them about antidepressants. If the person can't get out of their depression and they're suicidal, it's like, what do they have to lose? 1 month on antidepressants. They'll know. Well, they might have to experiment longer, because it would depend on, you know, some people respond better to some classes of antidepressants than the others. It's worth having a war with someone if they're in dire straits and they won't do everything they can to get better. ECT works, electroconvulsive therapy works for intractable depression. It's a terrible thing to contemplate, but the modern versions of ECT aren't One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And again, it's like there's no coming back from death. So, look, it isn't clear. You can't rescue everyone. People get sick and they die. And sometimes the way they die looks like it's depression. Depression is a multifaceted phenomenon. You can be there for them, you can listen, you can watch, you can intervene, you can try to understand, you can hold them accountable, you can do all of those things. But everyone has their own destiny, you know, and you're not omnipotent. And so sometimes a catastrophe occurs, like your daughter's. And then you should try to drag the least amount of misery forward that you can. Once you recover from your grief.
You know, if you take people, then you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. Probably running at about 51% of our capacity. Something, I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be, who knows how much more efficient? 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. You know, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life and they still suffer. Yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you. If you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really